Hey everyone, Ryan Freese here with Millennial Tech Zone, and today I want to walk you through OAuth 2.0. Chances are if you're watching this video, you probably already know at least a little bit of what OAuth is from a high level, but my goal in this video is to walk you through exactly how the OAuth protocol works, understand the different terms in the OAuth protocol, as well as provide an overview of what OpenID Connect is. After all, as I was doing research in this, of course, there's a lot of great videos out there that help you understand the concept, but if you look at things like different blog posts, so on and so forth, it's a little challenging to digest all the information, so my goal is to put all this together to make it simple for all of you. And to start, it's important to understand the problem of what OAuth 2.0 or OAuth in general was trying to initially solve for. And to do that, let's take a time machine, let's rewind back before OAuth was ever created and the problem it's trying to solve for. If we look back at your typical authentication options, where you have, of course, you have your traditional logon screen. So your simple form, your browser cookies. This is that typical scenario where if you're going to, let's say, check out of your shopping cart and it's asking you to create an account, you're probably, in the past, just create an account through this web application's website. You might have used single sign-on in the past. So this is where you have a portal, which you have different application icons. You might have one for like Workday, Salesforce, ADP, in which if you click any of those applications, those icons, it subsequently sends you to the website for that application in which you're single sign-on in automatically. This is typically using the SAML protocol behind the scenes. And honestly, I was a consumer of this myself. It worked really great from an end user perspective, but it was a bit of a challenge to implement. It's very XML heavy. Also, of course, as mobile apps continue to get more and more pertinent in the market, we needed to enable authentication to these different mobile applications. And then lastly, what we're going to spend most of our time talking about is something called Delegated Authorization, which is what OAuth is trying to solve for. So if you're unaware with what delegated authorization is, the concept is that, let's say you have your data stored in some website or application. So take Facebook as an example. This is probably the most common. And let's say we want to give another application access to that information. For example, so for your birthday, if you've ever been to Outback, they give you a free meal for your birthday in Outback. Let's say you wanted to share what your birthday was from Facebook to Outback. Well, before OAuth was created, there was no great way to do this. Today, though, you probably have seen, something like this a bajillion times, in which, you're being asked that, hey, we're trying to gain access to your Facebook account, and this is going to access specific items like your email address or your birthday to earn that free steak dinner, of course. And this process is actually using OAuth behind the scenes. So let's take a look at an example. So I'm a huge movie fan, so one of my go-to clutch movie review websites is Rotten Tomatoes. I usually check Rotten Tomatoes before I ever buy a movie ticket just to make sure the overall audience score is positive for that movie. I personally could care less about the critic score, but I do care about what the general masses thinks about the movie. So let's say we go over to Rotten Tomatoes website here. So here we are, RottenTomatoes.com, and let's say I want to sign up. So I can either sign up using their simple logon form here, or you can see I have this option to sign up with Facebook. And this is using OAuth 2.0 behind the scenes. So if we go back to my slide here, this is the typical workflow we would see from an end user perspective. So I go to RottenTomatoes.com, I go sign up, I choose sign up with Facebook. It's sending me over to Facebook to authenticate. So this is important to note. It's not authenticating on Rotten Tomatoes using my Facebook credentials. It is authenticating with Facebook. It's all happening on the Facebook side. So it stays with Facebook with identity provider. From there, Rotten Tomatoes is going to say something like, hey, I'm requesting access to your email address. Is that okay? If it's okay, of course, you'd say something like continue. So continue as Ryan. In which case, Rotten Tomatoes is configured with a callback. I think in Rotten Tomatoes case, it sends you back to the home page, but if there is something specific in which the redirect wants to send you to, that would be the callback. And then Rotten Tomatoes is getting access to a user's API from Facebook to gain access to that information that you consented as a user. Before we go into a deeper dive of the actual authorization workflow, there's some important terminologies for you to understand. So first we have the resource owner. This is the user behind the keyboard. So this is you, this is me, this is the person that's granting consent. We have the client. This is Rotten Tomatoes in our example. So this is the application that needs access to those specific data points. So an email address or a birthday as an example. We have the authorization server. This is the server or system that actually owns the identity of the user. So in our case, it's Facebook. We have the resource server. This is the system that holds the data that the actual client wants to get access to. We have the authorization grant. So this is when the user actually hits yes or allow or maybe even no, depending on the use case. And this generates a temporary token that the user accepted the prompt that is actually sent back to the client. And then it uses that authorization grant to gain access to something called an access token. And I'll explain how the access token works in the next slide or two. Then we have a scope. So this is a specific type of permissions that we want to get access to. So again, this might be like your email or your birthday as an example. And then we have consent. And this is the permissions the resource server asks for the resource owner has to grant. So this is where the resource owner grants consent to a specific permission. All right, so let's take a deeper look into the authorization workflow. So we're going to use the same example here, just in more detail. So of course you can see here I have myself, I have the resource owner, the user that's connecting to the actual client, which in our case is Rotten Tomatoes. Here, let's say we already signed up. Now we're going to choose to log into Facebook. What we're going to do is we're going to connect to the authorization server first, and we're going to send a few things during that initial connection. So we're going to send things like the redirect URI. So again, after you authorize with Facebook, this is going to be your callback where you're going to be sent back as far as the exact URL for Rotten Tomatoes. We're going to ask for a response type of code. We also have a response type of token, but I'll explain that in a little bit. Code is what you would typically use for a traditional explicit authorization workflow. Let's say for our scope, we want to ask for the email as well as the user birthday. If we just wanted the email, which I think is what Rotten Tomato just asked for, we would just have the scope as email. But for example's sake, let's say we're asking for email and user birthday. From there, we're going to connect to the authorization server. So this is going to be the exact URL in which you're calling for the OAuth protocol from that actual authorization server. So in this case, this is going to be Facebook. So here we're redirected to, hey, log into your Facebook account with Rotten Tomatoes. So we're going to log in as a user. We're going to, from there, the authorization server is going to request consent from the resource owner. So Rotten Tomatoes, they're asking for access to your email address. So either you would hit yes or you're going to decline that consent. From there, we're sent back to the redirect URI, and then we're also being sent an authorization code from the authorization server. So here now we're back to the Rotten Tomatoes homepage. From there, the actual client, so Rotten Tomatoes, is exchanging the authorization code for something called an access token from the authorization server, so from Facebook. And the access token is what is used to gain access to those specific permissions. So in this case, the email address. From there, we're going to contact the resource server with the actual access token saying, hey, Mr. Resource Server, we have this access token which gives us permission to gain access to this email address. So I'm going to now reach out to the resource server's API for users that has the email address associated with that. And now I'm going to be granted that permission to gain access to that email address. That access token has very specific sets of permission embedded into it. So if I tried to gain access to, let's say, user birthday, and that wasn't included in my scope, I would be denied that access. Similarly, if I tried to go in and delete that email address, but I wasn't granted permission for that with embedded in that access token, I'm going to be denied the ability to delete that email address. So it's very important. The scope is super critical when gaining access to individual permission, as well as the user consent, to consent this client for getting access to specific information that you have within your other account, right? Because again, we're trying to gain access to this data that lives in another account, in our case, Facebook. All right, now I want to walk you through the difference between the front and the back channel. This may or may not be relevant to you depending on if you're trying to incorporate OAuth into your own application, but this is important to know from an overall security perspective, is what the difference between the front versus the back channel and the difference between an explicit and an implicit workflow is. So if we take our traditional example, we're just looking at everything up to the point where we're sending the authorization code and we're redirecting the user to the redirect URI is happening within the front channel. The actual exchange for the access token and contacting the resource server with the access token in a traditional workflow model, an explicit workflow model, is all happening within the back channel itself. And this is done for security reasons. If we were exchanging for that access token in the front channel, well, if there was a bad guy that was looking into your browser information, they could potentially obtain that access token. It's fairly unlikely, but there is that slim possibility in which they're able to grab their hand on that actual access token if that was exchanged in the front channel. So we leverage the back channel from the actual client to the resource server, to the authorization server, to exchange that authorization code for the access token. So it's all about security in this scenario. So if we look at a traditional implicit workflow, so using just the front channel only, the biggest difference between an explicit workflow and an implicit workflow, I should say, is this response type here. So rather than exchanging code, we're exchanging the actual token. So basically this means that instead of asking for code back, we're getting the actual access token back. This means we no longer have that exchange step anymore. There's no exchanging of the authorization code for the access token. It's all happening in the front channel. And this also means, there's no insurance that the access token wasn't intercepted somewhere, because now this is all occurring in the front channel. So just know, again, this may or may not be as relevant to you, but know that there is a front channel and a back channel for an OAuth workflow. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk through identity use cases. And this is, not specifically catered towards OAuth 2.0. We're just talking about identity in general, in which case we have three primary authentication use cases. So we have things like a simple logon form. So this is your traditional logon form in which if you go to a website and you sign up and you log on to that website, think of your banking application. This is that scenario. We have single sign-on across different sites. So this is especially great in a corporate setting in which you have a lot of corporate applications and you need access to all of these applications and you don't want to have to re-authenticate with a different username, different password for all of those. Your organization might give you an SSO portal to make that experience a little bit easier for you as an employee. We have mobile app logon. So this is just logging into a mobile application on your mobile device. And then we have that authorization workflow in which we're authorizing access to individual resources from one application to another. So that's, of course, where OAuth comes into place. So if we talk about OAuth 2.0, we have now something called OpenID Connect. And where OpenID Connect came from is OAuth originally had no standard way to get a user's information, like their name, like their email address, profile picture, so on and so forth. So to solve for that problem, a new protocol was created, and that's where we have OpenID Connect. Essentially, it's a layer on top of the OAuth 2.0 workflow in which we have in place today to add additional capabilities for identity. So now we have things like a standard set of scopes for the identity for the user. We have a new endpoint called user info for getting more user information, and we have an ID token that can now be used to get that information for the actual user. All right, so let's talk through the OpenID Connect authorization workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and build out this slide from a front channel perspective. And what you'll notice immediately that's a little different here is in yellow, the scope is different than what we're traditionally using. So before we're leveraging email and birthday, which by the way, we could still do email and birthday here, as well as OpenID, which is a new scope we're sending over to the authorization server, leveraging OpenID. So we're still going to have the same workflow, right? We're going to send stuff over to the authorization server. We're going to request consent from the resource owner. We're going to get that authorization code and we're going to redirect the user to that redirect URI. However, because we leverage that OpenID scope that OpenID Connect made available to us, when we exchange that authorization code for an access token, we're also able to request an ID token as well. And once we have that ID token, we have access to that new endpoint I mentioned earlier, in which we can get the user information, things like their profile picture, their name, and so on and so forth, leveraging that ID token, right? So that shouldn't say access token here, that should say ID token. And that's what OpenID Connect is providing us is the ability to gain the information about the user, which wasn't traditionally there with OAuth 2.0. As I mentioned before, it was created for authorization. So as a quick recap, OAuth is used for authorization. We talked through the terminology that's good to know within the OAuth 2.0 workflow. We walked through that workflow. We talked briefly through the front channel and the back channel. And then lastly, we talked about how OpenID Connect was developed as a layer on top of OAuth 2.0 to handle the user information, to handle the access of the identity of that actual user. So I hope this video was helpful for all of you. Would really appreciate if you like today's video, subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up for today's video. And yeah, if you have any questions, let me know by writing in the comment box below. Thanks all.